The West German town of Solingen was rocked by a deadly Islamist attack last week. 3 people were killed and 8 people were injured in a knifing spree. IS, Islamic State, have claimed responsibility for this. It was happening during a festival of diversity, celebrating the town's 650th anniversary. Tom, I mean, what have you made of this? It feels like Islamist terror is making a return to Europe, but it's as if it doesn't seem to puncture the front pages for very long. You know?
And it hasn't really gone away either. I think that's something that's worth stressing, because this attack feels in many respects like the culmination of something that was coming in Germany, but also across Europe for some time now. I mean, there was this attack. There was also, of course, the Mannheim stabbing in Germany back in May, I believe, where someone stabbed. There was a multiple stabbing at a kind of anti-Islam rally, ended up leading to the death of one police officer and the injury of many more, believed to have an Islamist motivation. But there's also been a string of foiled plots.
Yeah.
Many of them ISIS-linked or Hamas-linked. There was a Hamas-linked plot back in December, which was foiled in Germany. Since then, there's been a string of cases which haven't made the news over here, but a group of teenagers who were found to be kind of plotting attacks on churches and so on, having amongst themselves pledged allegiance to the Islamic State. There was a case of a plot believed to be against the Swedish parliament, which was going to be hatched from Germany, which was foiled. There was an individual, I believe from Iraq, who was believed to basically be awaiting his orders, willing to carry out ISIS-linked plots and so on. So there's been this whole string of these, which haven't made the news over here, but obviously have been creating this drumbeat towards what we saw over the past week in Solingen. There was another plot as well during the Euros, which was foiled just before the England and Spain final. So this is something which there's a depressing inevitability towards all of it. But what is also depressing is the fact that we now treat these attacks like it's sort of just bad weather, like it flares up from time to time, but there's not much that can really be done about it. I think we really need to drop that, not least because I think it lets the government off the hook for the role they've played in failing to keep people safe and for maintaining policies which have raised the likelihood that something like this could happen, not least because in this case, this was a Syrian asylum seeker who should have been deported but wasn't. So all of these questions are raised by this. And to just dismiss it as, well, it's going to happen from time to time seems to let a lot of people off the hook.
Yeah, he basically managed to stay for long enough that his deportation order expired, which is pretty shocking.
And he wasn't at his refugee accommodation when they turned up to get him. That seems to me too easy a loophole to exploit, I dare say.
And that's therefore the end of the matter. Yeah, it is extraordinary. And what continually shocks me, and perhaps it shouldn't, is the unwillingness of the establishment across Europe to confront Islamism as an ideological threat. I mean, it was striking that actually when the German coalition came to power a couple of years ago, it actually disbanded a working group on Islamism and replaced it with a working group on Islamophobia. And it feels like that sort of encapsulates exactly the problem here. There's just a real cowardice around this issue. As you say, Tom, we treat it as a problem of bad weather, or perhaps it's a technical problem. The German government is currently going after knives, seeing that, knife ownership is the big problem. Okay, I'm not in favor of people owning knives, but that clearly isn't what motivated this attack. Solingen, ironically, is known for manufacturing knives. It's called in Germany the City of Blades. It hasn't had a terror attack like this in its 650 years of existence. It's the Islamist factor that has made this happen. Luke, what do you make of that sort of cowardice in the face of Islamist terror?
Yeah, I think cowardice is the right word. I mean, we didn't mention the Taylor Swift concerts that were cancelled, and the details that are emerging about that plot seem absolutely unbelievable, that they were targeting tens of thousands of people, intending to kill many thousands of young people at a pop concert, something we've seen, in this country as well. And so we don't seem willing to talk about the absolute barbarism that's sitting under the surface in Europe. And I'll just mention the riots quickly, because I do think that was a remarkable moment where, in the immediate aftermath of what we knew about the Southport stabbings, which was that young children, young girls had been targeted at a Taylor Swift dance class, people suddenly believed that this was an Islamist attack. And everyone said, this is only the result of misinformation online. And for me, that was a really interesting moment, because the real question is, why did people believe that? And the people believed that because it looked exactly like an Islamist attack. We know now that it has nothing to do with Islam, but it looked like an Islamist attack. And I think that's what we're failing to grapple with, is the fact that people are so frustrated about the failure to look this problem in the face. And I think that's where some of the anger around the riots come from, not to legitimize them in any way at all. But I think there was a moment where the idea that this was simply misinformation that sparked these riots, that had simply no basis in reality. I think that was an interesting moment that highlighted our unwillingness to say that this did look like an Islamist attack. It did look like a lot of the other attacks that have happened in this country and abroad, which were directly connected to Islamism. So I do think there needs to be a reckoning. I don't know what that reckoning looks like. It's about recognizing Islamism in the different forms that it arises. It's not just in the form of terror attacks, but it does take the form of anti-Israel protests that we've seen in this country. We've seen Islamist sentiment expressed on those marches, the idea that we should remove Israel from the map, from the river to the sea, etc. These are all, disturbances outside primary schools when particular lessons have been taught. The Batley Grammar School. All of these instances seem to just come and go, and we seem to just live with them. And until we have some kind of public discussion around how we respond to that ideological threat, I think we're in a very dangerous place indeed.
Definitely. Tom?
And I think part of the what makes this so shocking is because of the fact that we're now getting into the period where it's just explicitly downplayed. And I think the riots, for all the horrendous things that came out of that, has also provided a pretext through which the Islamist problem can be downplayed, despite the fact, as we talked about on the show last week. I mean, to suggest that the majority of the threat comes from Islamism is to almost understate it. I mean, it's overwhelming if you look at certainly the body count, certainly the amount of MI5 caseload, which is concerned with Islamist terrorism versus any other variety of it. And I think now that's what we're going to see. We're going to see long, kind of ponderous discussions that we saw from Keir Starmer this week about the threat from the far right and so on. All the while, this other form of the far right, if you want to say it, certainly its most lethal form on Britain's streets in the 21st century, is going to be completely ignored. And also, I think a lot of the tricky questions are going to be ignored around the fact that whilst there has been at least some discussion about the kind of homegrown terrorism component and the way in which that people even brought up in Western societies grow to loathe them and hate them, there is also this security question around borders, because we have seen a string of attacks of relatively recent arrivals. There was even, everyone's forgotten about this now, but the terror attack in last October in Hartlepool, where you had a gentleman, I believe, who had been kind of floating around Europe, being denied asylum everywhere he went, ends up in Britain, and is in refugee accommodation, becomes obsessed with Hamas on October 7th, and ends up stabbing one of his housemates to death, himself a refugee and asylum seeker. This isn't just a threat to people who are already living in this country, because he'd converted to Christianity and he wasn't too happy with that. And then he went out into the street and stabbed a man to death. Everyone's forgotten about that case completely. We weren't allowed to report it at the time. It was all shrouded in mystery. It's only recently kind of made its way through the courts and been clear that it was terror. It was actually branded a terrorist crime. But there's been no discussion about that whatsoever. And I dare say that's going to be the pattern that's going to be repeated in the years to come.